Well, this is Ed Stetzer Live, and this and every Saturday at this time we have conversations, and I'm excited about our conversation today. This is actually a pre-recorded episode, and so we won't be able to take your calls like we normally do, but that gives us more time to have with our guest, and we've got a great guest, a great book, a great conversation as well. My name's Ed Stetzer. I'm the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, and I guess a motivational speaker sometimes that lives in a van down by the river. But for every Saturday at this time, I'm your radio host here at Ed Stetzer Live. And of course, many of you, an increasing number of you, listen on podcast. And so you can always go to edstetzerlive.com, and there you'll find the links to the podcast. You can subscribe to any of our Moody Radio shows. Also, the link to the book we're going to talk about today. More information about the author, past shows, it's all at edstetzerlive.com. So head over there and get that information as well. So I minded my own business the other day, and I'm not a sports ball person. I don't know much about the sports. I mean, the Dodgers won the World Series, and so I become this late fan. You know, when I planted my first church, Don and I went to Buffalo, and when we were there, the Buffalo Bills went to the Super Bowl 4 times out of the 5 years we lived there. So we were like Buffalo Bills fans because you kind of had to. And then we stopped watching sports. We moved to Chicago, and the Cubs went to the World Series. It could be us. So we watched the World Series, and we moved to the Los Angeles area. And then the Dodgers have gone twice since we've lived here. We'd like to take responsibility for that. Now, one of our the lead chaplain for the Dodgers, is one of our faculty at the Talbot School of Theology. So I went to a game. So I had to got to get a little bit interested in sports ball, and I watched every game of the World Series. And yay, sports ball! And they won the Stanley Cup, and I'm excited for them. So okay, but I don't know anything about sports. That person you're laughing, by the way, is our guest. But I don't know anything about sports, as you can tell. But I'm watching, I'm a Christian, so I know who Tim Tebow is, right? So I'm like, Tim Tebow's kind of a big deal. And I know he played some football, and now he works with children with special needs. I love these things. And I'm minding my own business, and I'm watching Tim Tebow on some interview somewhere, and he brings up our guest today. Our guest today is Dr. Carmen Imes. And he mentions her. Let me introduce her. Dr. Carmen Imes is Associate Professor of Old Testament at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. She's the author of Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters, Becoming God's Family, Why the Church Still Matters. You can tell I got a theme there. Her primary areas of expertise are the Exodus and the Psalms, and she's passionate about equipping the church to engage the Old Testament well and see its relevance for the Christian life. Matter of fact, if you go to edstetzerlive.com, you click through, you'll see Torah Tuesday, where she kind of works through the Torah. Anyway, so I'm watching this, Carmen Imes, and I don't know if you knew this was coming, but it appears that Tebow's a big fan of your work, and he starts talking about Carmen Imes. I'm like, I know her. I look like Buddy from Elf. I know her. Did you know that Tebow's into the book?
Yeah, well, I just have to say that when I did my PhD at Wheaton College in biblical theology with a concentration in Old Testament, nobody told me Tim Tebow would come calling and want my expertise. But about 1.5 years ago, his team reached out to me and said, hey, Timmy wants to meet with you over Zoom to talk about the image of God. And I was like, okay, let's do this. And so we met on Zoom, and we talked about this project that he was working on. He wanted scholarly expertise to make sure that he was talking about the image of God in ways that were biblically faithful, theologically rooted. And so we had a great time. We did not talk about football or baseball. We just talked about the image of God. And I really
Does he play baseball too?
He played baseball for a while, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, see, it's like that's. I remember Bo Jackson. Bo did that, so I don't even know.
Yep,
okay,
yep.
See. I learned a thing right here. So you're watching, and now he's got a new book out, but he's quoting your book in his interviews. So did you know that was coming?
Well, I'm not totally shocked. I was a little surprised. He was working on the book when we talked, and then he sent me drafts of the book so that I could make sure that the way he was talking about the image of God was still like he's expressing it right. You know, there's all this nuance that scholars care about. And so I helped him with a couple sections of the book. I'm not totally shocked to have had a shout out, but it is really fun to hear him say, and I've heard him say it on a couple different interviews, that my work was really formative for him. He was already doing so much good work with people with disabilities, and he has this National Night to Shine event, annual event where he puts on like a prom-like experience for people with special needs. And he's well known for that. And he really believes that every human being is the image of God and has inherent dignity and worth. And it's not based on what we produce or how we perform. And so we really connected on that issue. I helped with the theological grounding for what he already knew was true. And now he's getting the message out there wide, and I'm so glad for that.
Yeah, and there is, we're going to talk about your new book, which is really more about church, which I love. I'm a church person. I get up every day loving the church, but the book, and there's kind of a thing, like when I say we're made, I'm going to use language that like normally we have used. We're made in the image of God. We're made in the image of God. That part of what you're trying to do is to help us to communicate that differently. So in other words, it's not being made in the image of God, but being God's image. You explain it. You explain it.
Yeah. So I became convinced that grammatically, it's better to express what's going on in Hebrew in Genesis 1. It's better to say that God made humankind as his image rather than in his image. And I think this translation probably stems from just basic grammar. Like if you're taking a Hebrew class, you learn that this preposition bait means in, and you start plugging it in everywhere. But really, prepositions in any language are very flexible. They have a lot of different things they can do. And there's not exact overlap between what a preposition does in one language and what it does in another language. So based on all the possible categories of meaning that that a bait could express in Hebrew, I became convinced that this is a bait of identity. It's saying what we are. It's not aspirational. It's not saying, we're sort of like the image or we're aspiring to be the image. It's actually just saying flat out, we are God's image. And so I do talk about the image a little differently than the average person. And it's an uphill climb because we're all used to saying it the other way.
Yeah, totally. And so, and I probably said it in front of you. I remember one time you nudged me, and I was like, I had to go read your book. So that was a lot of time and effort that I had to put into that to understand your argument. Which I like it though. I think it does make sense. So from like an average Christian listening right now, what difference does it make that if I say I'm made in the image of God versus I'm God's image?
I think you can say it either way as long as you understand that the image of God is your identity, and it's not something that you can set down and walk away from. People talk about bearing God's image as if it's something we're carrying, and I don't want to use that language because the Bible doesn't give us any way to wiggle out of the image of God. We just are God's image, and we never can be disqualified from that identity. We can live out of alignment with it, but we can never erase what's fundamentally true about us and about every person we encounter. Every person is the image of God.
Which then you would see why Tim Tebow, not that this is an interview about Tim Tebow, it's just going to be an interview about your book, but you can see why Tim Tebow, particularly with his work with children with special needs, in a world that wants to discard, some of these children, would say this is an important concept for us to understand. So how is he applying that? And then I want to pivot to your book. How is he applying that?
Yeah, he's reaching out and letting people with disabilities know that they have inherent value and worth because of who God made them to be, that they are God's image every bit as much as you and I are God's image. And he also works in anti-human trafficking. That's another arm of his foundation where he's trying to bring people out from being used and abused by others. And both of these efforts are united by the same commitment to seeing every human being as God's image.
Love it. Okay, good. Enough talk about Tim Tebow because I didn't even know the man played baseball. I met him once, and he seemed very nice, and I met his wife once, and they seemed very nice, but that's all that I know about these people. So let's move back to Carmen Imes and her new book. Is called Becoming God's Family, Why the Church Still Matters. And Carmen, here's the deal. I mean, you're active online. I'm active online. Caring about the church, I mean, that's so 2010. It's like right now, it's all about people yelling at each other online, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
I mean, we're supposed to sort of be disgusted with the church. It's constantly failing us. It's no good. Why I mean, even like, why as an Old Testament scholar, why are you writing on the church?
And I think you and I were both really concerned when the pandemic hit at what the impact would be on the church. And I remember listening to you online. This was back before you were my boss, and we shared this concern that the church has a reckoning to do. Like there. I remember hearing you talk about how this is going to change everything, and we would have to pivot and we would have to respond in creative ways to help people stay connected. And I think through that season of remote worship, of social distancing in various ways, or of masking when we gather together, all these different dimensions of the COVID experience, my concern was, how do we make the case that we need to come back together? Because there were a lot of people who disconnected from their routine of going to church and then thought, this is actually kind of nice to have a morning off and not be rushing off
Hmm.
somewhere. So maybe we don't really need to go. And I realized that we were going to need to make the case for why embodied community is important for our spiritual health and for our growth. And that we actually, what I'm arguing in the book is, we actually cannot experience the kind of spiritual growth and encounter with God that we're designed for if we don't participate in the church.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, and this is where like I get some people mad at me because I'm like, I think true biblical community is best expressed. Now there are exceptions. You know, we have persons with disabilities, we have access, but true biblical community is best expressed with feet and faces, not electrons and avatars. I think we need to be up in each other's lives, in each
Yes.
other's community. And so
Yep.
that's why when I saw you writing on this, I was kind of fascinated about it. But let me come back to this, because
Mhm.
you even start the book sort of starts with Abraham. But
Yep.
but why an Old Testament professor? Like, this is not
Yeah.
the church isn't in the Old Testament. Let me throw that out to see if I can rally you up. But talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, a lot of people think of the church as something that started at the day of Pentecost. Even our doctrinal statements make it sound like that's when it started. But really, if we're going to talk about how God's presence comes among the gathered community, we have to go all the way back to where God first calls a community into being in the Old Testament. And I feel like to not look at the Old Testament community of faith just cuts us off from all kinds of rich resources for reflection about how to be together well and what it looks like when we go off track. There's so much food for thought in the Old Testament, and that's why I wanted to start there.
Okay, we're going to continue our conversation with Carmen Imes in just a minute, and we're going to continue. Remember, we're not taking your calls today, but we are going to continue to press in on what it means to be church, why is that a biblical teaching, and more. So stay with us. The new book that, again, it's just out is Becoming God's Family: Why the Church Still Matters. Carmen Imes is our guest. You're listening to Ed Stetzer Live. We're going to continue our conversation, and hopefully I'll be asking some good questions in your place. Stay with us as we continue our conversation with Carmen Imes about the church. Okay, we're back. Ed Stetzer Live. Remember, we're a pre-recorded show, so we're not taking your calls, but we're having a great conversation with Carmen Imes. Her new book is Becoming God's Family: Why the Church Still Matters. By the way, I want to come back to your book in just a second, but what got you interested in the Old Testament? You know, because we've got this, you've got this passion for it. I mean, you're literally doing Torah Tuesday. We linked to that in the show notes at edstetzerlive.com. So, like, what woke you up in the morning and said, I'm not going to study the book of Philippians, I want to study the Old Testament?
You know, I can think back all the way to my childhood and remember having a fascination with the Old Testament. I don't think I really divided the Bible into two categories the way we do in academics. I loved the Bible. I loved all of it. And I started a club at recess when I was in second grade to read through the whole Bible at recess. So I was that kind of kid, and did have trouble making friends. So I would say that it's not a shock that I ended up in Old Testament, but what I noticed when I went off to Bible college is that my Old Testament, so I had Bible professors who specialized in Old Testament and New Testament, but they all had to teach the whole Bible. And I noticed that those who had done their training in Old Testament seemed to be able to handle the entire Bible really well. And those who had focused on New Testament sometimes felt out of their depth in the Old Testament. So I don't know why that is. I just think that made me gravitate towards the Old Testament is the part of the Bible that people struggle with the most. So if I focused on that, I could be most useful to the church.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I would say that most questions I get are related to the Old Testament, not the New. Though I would say most
Hmm.
pastors spend their time in the New Testament, not the
Yep.
Old. But you can't really teach
Yeah.
or preach faithfully the New Testament without understanding the Old
Yeah.
Testament as well. And what do you do on Torah Tuesdays?
So I'm working my way through the book of Exodus. I'm writing a commentary for Baker Academic on Exodus. And so for the past 5 years, I've been going verse by verse, paragraph by paragraph through Exodus and sharing the cool things I'm learning as I work on the commentary. I just felt like I was learning so much and I didn't want to wait 7 years to share it with people before the commentary would be published. So you can find videos, hundreds of videos, working through the first 24 chapters of the book. I've taken a bit of a hiatus from those videos to do some book recommendation videos, but I'll be back to Torah Tuesday really soon.
Torah Tuesday. Yeah. Good times. I know that people. That's how when people talk about you on the road, they mention Torah Tuesday to me
Mm.
pretty regularly. So
Hmm.
it's sort of a fun thing. And actually, I'll be on my way to England, and then I'll be after that going to Egypt. So I'll be having
Mm.
conversations about the Exodus and
Yeah.
you've got this focus on Sinai a little bit as well. Tell us about that.
Yep. Yeah. So my doctoral dissertation was on the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. And I did a deep dive on that command and became convinced that we've been misunderstanding it, that it's not really a prohibition of swearing per se or using God's name flippantly, although we shouldn't do that. This command is much broader. It's about how God's people have been stamped with God's name at Sinai. He's claimed them as his own by putting his name on them. They have like this invisible tattoo, if you will, and he's telling them not to carry his name in vain. So in Hebrew, it's you shall not carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain. So I am arguing that this is actually a missional command, that it has to do with God's people's duty to represent God among the nations. And that's a a vocation that the church inherits or is incorporated into through faith in Jesus. So Peter uses the same titles to describe Gentile believers as were used at Sinai to describe the people of Israel: kingdom of priests, holy nation, treasured possession. These titles indicate that we have inherited Israel's Israel's identity and vocation, not in the sense that we've replaced Israel, but that we've been grafted in, as Paul talks about. And so I think Sinai matters because that's where we find out what it means to be part of the community of faith.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so let's go back to the Old Testament, but heading towards the church. So you talked
Mhm.
about this a little bit, but how does the Old Testament help us to understand the church in the New Covenant age?
Hmm. Yeah, so we see God raising up Abraham and Sarah and saying that through their family, all nations will be blessed. And so from the very beginning, God doesn't start an institution, he starts a family. He selects a family to be the heirs of his blessing and the conduits of that blessing to the nations. And as his family expands, Abraham they give birth to Isaac and then Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. And so there's this expansion in Jacob's family to the 12 tribes of Israel. But that expansion then begins making space for others, for foreigners to join the people of God. So from the beginning, God is setting his people like a city on a hill so that the nations around can see God's character on display as he acts on their behalf, and they can learn what it looks like to follow Yahweh. So I think a wonderful example of this is Rahab. When the spies get to Jericho, she testifies that Yahweh is the great God of all, that he delivered them from Pharaoh, and that he is giving them the land of Canaan. So she declares allegiance to him. And so then she's able to be incorporated into the faith community. So we see things like that happening throughout the Old Testament. And we see that God wants to dwell among his people. It's not just like he sets them free from slavery in Egypt and then says, okay, go have a nice life. Do you. He doesn't. He calls them into relationship with himself as a community. They camp around Mount Sinai. And then when they build the tabernacle and God's presence comes down in their midst, they camp around his presence. And his presence is the defining factor. It's the glue that holds them together. And so we just have so much to learn from the primacy of God's presence among the people and from the way that he's calling them into living in a righteous way so that the nations can know who he is.
And so then how do you connect that to the church? Because we might
Yeah.
picture, people gathered around the tabernacle, but now how does that
Yep.
connect to the life of the church?
Yeah, so I do start the book with Pentecost and that
Right.
moment in Acts chapter 2 where the Spirit comes down on everybody's heads in flames of fire. And they're asking, what does this mean? And to answer the question, what does this mean? We have to go back to the series of events that punctuate the Old Testament where God's presence falls like fire on the tabernacle, on the temple. He continually marks the place of his presence where he wants them to gather to worship. And in Acts chapter 2, when the Spirit falls on the gathered community rather than on the altar in the temple, it seems to be indicating that the new temple is made up of believers in Jesus who are following him and gathering with one another. They are together being built into a temple. And so now, if you want to experience the presence of God, there's not a temple to go to. You gather with other believers, and that's where you're going to have that encounter.
And so that continuity is something that's present. And so,
Yeah.
but we do think of the church as a new community. So how is it new in contrast to the people of God in the Old Testament?
Yeah, it's new in the ways that it's radically inclusive of people from other nations. The Gentiles are allowed to be part of this new community without undergoing circumcision and conversion to Judaism. So there is the vision of the New Testament is a multi-ethnic, intergenerational, and multi-class denomination. That the community of faith cuts across all the divisions of ethnicity, of social status, and it unites people around the table as we fellowship with one another, and it calls us to become a family. So here's where it's different. In the Old Testament, they are literally the family of Abraham. And if you want to be incorporated, then you marry into it. And in the New Testament, it becomes a non-biological family that nevertheless includes people in to participate in ways that are family-like. So we end up doing life together and caring for one another in ways that are expected of families. So I mentioned to you before we started recording that my dad was hospitalized this weekend, and he's in Colorado, I'm in California, and what I've seen over the past 24 hours is the family of God activated as various friends who are believers in Jesus and brothers in Christ have come around my dad and provided the support that he needs, just in really practical ways, helping him get dressed, helping him clean up messes, talking to the doctor and advocating for his care, making sure he gets breakfast, filling up his medication dispenser, just all the kinds of ways that my dad needs physical care. They're doing the kind of things that I, as his biological daughter, want to be doing, but I can't because I'm here. And it's such a beautiful thing when the body of Christ comes together and serves one another in family-like ways.
Yeah, and I think ultimately that's one of the shocking things to people in the world. Like, wait, you care for each other in these ways and at this
Yes.
level, and you go back 2,000 years
Yes.
ago. Again, that was that inclusivity that was kind of shocking to people. Where hey, we even see it sort of mentioned sometimes in the pages of the New Testament. Treat women as sisters and treat older men as fathers, and okay, well, this is actually what it looks like in a new family. We've got a little less than a minute, so I want to then talk about why are you writing a book are you trying to persuade people to re-engage church? And then we'll continue on the other side, but talk to me about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm writing this book for three people, for the people who've walked away from the church and are kind of wondering, have this nagging question, am I missing anything? I'm wanting to invite them back. I'm writing for the person who has got one foot out the door. Maybe they're disillusioned or frustrated by their church, and they're saying, give me one good reason to stay. And I'm writing for church leaders and those who are all in to help articulate what is it that we're even doing when we gather, and how can we be the healthiest version possible of what God's calling us to be.
We're going to continue our conversation with Carmen Imes and really press in on what it means to be the people of God. Now, here's the reality. Years ago, I did some research for Moody Radio, and I know that about 25 to 30% of our listeners at Moody Radio are not engaged and involved in a local church. Why should you be? Why does this matter? And more. And those who are, what about the drama about church? What about all the problems with church? We're going to continue our conversation with these topics and Carmen Imes in just a moment. Stay with us. Okay, we're back. Continue our conversation with Carmen Imes, who's written several books that are fascinating and really been the source of a lot of conversation. People have been talking about her writing and her work, which is what you want as a professor, by the way. Her new book is Becoming God's Family, Why the Church Still Matters, which, again, I don't know if it's a departure, but it's not the typical sort of the Old Testament rooted, but kind of leading us into, actually the book kind of takes us eventually to the new temple. We'll kind of walk through some of that as well. But Carmen, I mean, this is where we get kind of pastoral in some of our conversation, right? Because I mean, the book is kind of, it's got both theological depth and practical church implications. But man, a lot of our listeners have been hurt by the church. I mean, churches...
Yes.
I mean, if it's like Noah's Ark, man. If it weren't for the water on the outside, the stink on the inside would kill you. So why would they want to see? That was an Old Testament reference for you. Why?
That was beautiful.
Well, I was quite proud of. I don't even. That's an old preacher joke, but why would I want to? When I can listen, I could listen to Moody Radio. I could listen to podcasts. I can listen to worship music. I can do this all on my own without having to deal with people who are a pain.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the thing about the church is we don't get to choose who we're with. God brings people through that door, and they're supposed to become family with us, and they might not have been the people we would have chosen or the leaders we would have chosen. I want to start by saying, if somebody's out there and they are disillusioned with church because they have seen problems, maybe you've witnessed abuse or you're aware of abuse and you know of leaders who've tried to cover it up, or you see toxic forms of leadership like narcissistic leaders, and you are just turned off by it. I want to just affirm that it's right for you to be bothered by these problems. And I'm not asking anyone to overlook them, to sweep them under the rug, to ignore them. I think we need to hold one another accountable to following Jesus well. And sometimes churches don't. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the problems in the church. But I don't think that the solution is to walk away, because we have a fundamental human need for connection with others who are also oriented towards our ultimate purpose of following Jesus. And so I don't think that we can flourish in the ways that we're meant to outside of the church. So one illustration that might help with this is if you think of, you go grocery shopping, say you come home with your groceries one week, and you find out that the loaf of bread that you bought is covered with mold, but you didn't see that in the store. And you're like, oh, gross. So then you have to decide, am I going to return? Am I just going to throw it away and call it a loss? Or am I going to go back to the store and try to get my money back and try to replace it? In any case, you're not going to eat that moldy bread. Well, what happens next week when it's time to get groceries again? Do you say, oh man, no way, I'm not getting groceries again because last time I got moldy bread? Or do you say, okay, no, I need to be more vigilant about the bread that I select so that I don't buy moldy bread? We don't stop eating bread because we got moldy bread one time. We still need the staff of life. And so I would encourage people, just because you've had a bad church experience, don't give up on church altogether, because you need it in order to flourish.
But okay, do I need it in order to flourish? Let's say I'm listening to my favorite Bible teacher on podcast or radio every
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
I'm worshiping on my own. Like, what's the case that I really need it rather than a solitary Christian experience?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think what's true about YouTube is that it's unidirectional, almost entirely unidirectional. If I'm your favorite Bible teacher and you're hearing me teach on YouTube, I'm not seeing, we're not making eye contact. I'm not actually able to give you a hug or handshake or ask about how things are going in your life. So you're hearing from me, but I'm not hearing from you. And relationships are built to be two-way. So we can, in a very limited sense, have some back and forth in the comments section on YouTube, which I actually answer myself. And so you could have some encounter with a real person, but it's still not the same as an embodied connection with someone. My parents went through a long season where they were unable to attend church in person because my mom had a traumatic brain injury. And so walking into a church with the lights and the sounds and the movement just would send her over the edge. And so they watched church online for several years, maybe 7, 8 years. And they received some nourishment from the teaching that they watched. But what was not sustainable about it is that they were not known and loved by those people on the screen. And we just need relationships with others. And without that support and encouragement and accountability, we can really go off the rails.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're an Old Testament scholar, you're a professor at the Calvin School of Theology. So, like, are you involved in a local church, and what does that look like for you?
I am. So we are part of a church in our neighborhood where my husband is a deacon. I am involved in reading scripture. I'm on the prayer team. I help host our services, which means leading the liturgy. We show up on work days to work side by side, painting walls, cleaning out gutters, whatever needs to be done to keep our church property functional and beautiful. We're part of a community group that's in our church, so we actually co-lead it, where we gather in someone's home each week for a meal and prayer and conversation. So all of these things are what knit us together. So as I've been in crisis this weekend with my dad and trying to support him in his hospital stay, I can text my community group and say, please pray, here's what's going on. And I've had so much outpouring of support and prayer support from this community group. And if I wasn't part of a church, I wouldn't have the same kind of network of people who have committed themselves to me and to my flourishing.
Yeah, and I think that also, if I could just be blunt, as a professor, you and I are both professors at the same school. Am I a professor? Yeah, I am a professor at school. I'm a dean and a professor. But anyway, sometimes I have to remember what I
Let's
actually
figure that out in a
do on
minute.
my contract. Yeah, exactly. Because I teach, but the only time I teach is I teach over in England, and I bring Talbot students.
Yeah.
So I guess anyway, I'm professor of ministry and leadership. I remember that now. Okay, but my point is that I think that one of the things I really love is how many of our faculty, and this is something, remember Moody Radio is owned by Moody Bible Institute. So we have this commitment at both Moody Bible and at Biola and so many Christian schools that our faculty are not outside of the church. We're part of the church. We don't,
Yeah.
man, I think you got to smell like the sheep. I mean, it's part
Yeah.
of understanding the struggles that people have. And I that really,
Yeah.
anyway, that matters to me. When I ask some of these questions, I should say that I knew Carmen goes to church. I'm just saying, I'm asking questions as if I don't. That's how
In fact,
radio works. But
if
anyway.
if you wanted to work at Biola University as a faculty member and did not go to church, that would be a serious red flag on your application and likely mean that you would not be hired. I mean, that's how seriously we take church commitment and church involvement. It's because it's such an essential part of the Christian life.
For sure. Okay, so what brings you hope when you think about the church? Like, what you're actually casting a positive vision for it. What gives you hope?
Yeah. So I do look full in the face of the hard stuff in the church. In the book, we look at the hard stories in the Bible and the hard stories in the headlines. But I also tell many stories that I hope will restore people's vision for what the church can become. Because I think for every negative headline about the church, there are 100 stories in out-of-the-way places that are not flashy enough to make the news, but they are evidence that God is at work doing what only the Lord can do through the church. And as I've traveled around this past year and spoken at churches just across the spectrum of denominations, spoken at conferences and retreats, and I have had so many opportunities to hear stories and see examples of how churches are creatively reaching out in their communities, loving their neighbors, and providing support in for whatever stage of life people are in. And it's been so inspiring to me because if you just spend a lot of time on Twitter, you can start to feel like the whole world is a dumpster fire. And it turns out that the dumpster fire on Twitter is a very small segment of what's true about the world today. And I have met so many wonderful people who love the Lord and are faithfully serving in their communities. I've just been really inspired by that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I would tell you that in the last, Twitter's always Twitter. Everyone's always yelling. But, just in the last few months, I guess I've spoken to about 10,000 pastors and church leaders in the last 3 or 4 months. And man, there's something going on. People are excited. They're seeing the
Yeah.
Lord do good things. I'm actually encouraged at this moment. But if you read Twitter, everyone's yelling all the time. You think that this is
Yeah.
that's not real. IRL, as the kids say today. In real life, the
Yeah.
Lord is
Yeah.
working through and in his church. What would be your exhortation towards listeners about who are maybe on the sidelines, not engaged and involved? What would you exhort them to do
Mhm.
next as far as church life goes?
Yeah, so tomorrow is Sunday. So what church is in your neighborhood? And can you uh, wander down to that church on Sunday and see what God is up to and see what you might be missing out on? I would encourage people not to look for a flashy place, and not to think about it as like shopping for something that checks all your boxes, but to go with a curiosity for how the Spirit of God is at work in your own community. And I think it's a really beautiful thing to see the ordinary examples of faithfulness that are just right close to home. It's so inspiring.
We have one more segment with Carmen Imes. Stay with us. We're going to continue our conversation with her. Remember, we're pre-recording today, so we're not taking your calls, but it's giving us more time to hear from Carmen, which is great as well. I love her passion for the local church. And remember, you can go to edstetzerlive.com. Once you're there, you can find links to all of her books, all of her resources, her bio, and more. And again, I want to encourage you to pick up a copy of Being God's Family. I think it'll be helpful as you consider your engagement in church life. Stay with us. Okay, we're back. Final segment with Carmen Imes. We're talking about her new book, Becoming God's Family, Why the Church Still Matters. And again, churches like, I don't know, like I'm a teaching pastor at Mariners Church, which is one of those big old churches that you could sit in and you could be hundreds of feet away from the front of the church and still participate. And you could just be this anonymous attendee, but that's not what we desire. We work very hard to move people from sitting in rows to sitting in circles. You're in a smaller church than that. Most people are in a smaller church than that. So you could say, well, I'll go to Mariners Church and I'll sit in the back. But what's the difference between going to a large church that I'm sitting hundreds of feet away from the pastor with watching it online? And so why is my physical presence, is that enough? Or do I need to get in deeper community or what?
Well, the physical presence is something. So don't think that, well, nobody would notice if I showed up or didn't, and so I'm just going to stay home and watch online. It actually, there's something really powerful about gathering in shared space and giving shared attention to the Word of God and to worship. And you might not realize the encouragement that it is to someone else to see you there physically. You showed up because you thought it mattered, and that bolsters their commitment to show up and have it matter. And there's more opportunities for eye contact and encouragement. So even if you're not super involved, it's still better to show up. But I would agree with you, Ed, that the goal is to get into a circle, not just sit in a row. And so I would say if you are attending a church, but you're slipping in and slipping out and not connecting with anyone, you're not going to experience all that God has designed for us to experience in the church. And so it actually takes some effort to push through that, overcome the inertia of sitting there and join a smaller community. If you're in a large church, it means joining a small group, a table group, a fellowship group, a midweek Bible study, somewhere where you can actually begin to form friendships that can be supportive through the seasons of life. If you're already in a small church, then it might mean jumping on a ministry team so that you can serve side by side with others. And I would say for everyone listening, the Spirit gifts us to make a contribution to our church. And church was never meant to be a spectator sport where we sit in the pews and the professionals do the thing on stage. It was always intended that we all bring the gifts we have and contribute them to the collective body for our collective flourishing. So whatever it is that God has gifted you to do, find a way to serve your church using those gifts. And it might be that the church isn't even doing anything currently that matches your skill set, but you could make the suggestion and say, "Hey, what if we did this? I kind of have a heart for this demographic or for this particular need, for meeting this need. Can I start something?" And I think it's really beautiful when all of us bring our whole selves to the task. So much more can happen than if we're just passive.
So more than attendance. It's more than attendance. I mean, you're kind
Yeah.
of like, as I look through the book, it's belonging, responsibility, mission. That, I mean, again, that's more than just showing up. So which for
Yep.
some of us, we're just struggling with showing up. So what
Yeah.
would be if I do that? Let's say I do those things. How does it make a difference in my life? How does it make a difference in the church? How does it make a difference in the world? Help me see a vision for belonging, responsibility, and mission.
Yeah, I'll use my mom as an example. She is someone who really notices people and notices when someone is struggling. And so she's had lots of invitations over the years to plug into this ministry or that ministry. And can you come teach Sunday school? Or can you come make food for this event? Or can you come serve by teaching people such and such? And none of these things are actually a good fit for how God has wired her. But she is committed to showing up early at her church and scanning the room and noticing if someone is struggling and going up to them and listening and sitting beside them and offering tangible support. And we need people who have that pastoral sensitivity to what others are going through and who will notice and offer prayer support. She understands that if she doesn't notice someone and connect with them, maybe no one will. And so her role is vital, even though she's not on payroll. And I would say that's true in so many different ways for all of us. You might be a really practical person who notices when the clock hasn't been reset after the time change, or where the weeds in a certain part of the parking lot are not being pulled, or where something's crooked that needs to be straightened, and you're someone who notices that and could take ownership and actually help in those really practical kind of administrative ways. And I think if all of us are allowing the Spirit to lead us to contribute in particular ways, then the whole becomes more beautiful.
I think you hit on it. I mean, it's like, how do I take that bold step? And for some of our listeners, that bold step is just to go visit a church near them. I think that's great advice you gave
Yep.
earlier. But
Yeah.
for others, it's okay, I got to move from being a customer of the religious
Hmm.
goods and services
Hmm.
distributed here to being a co-laborer in the gospel. So,
Yeah.
so how do I find that? How do I find that courage to raise a hand and step forward?
Yeah. I think there is maybe a cultural trend that I've noticed over the past while, for people to just hang back and kind of wait for someone to tap them on the shoulder and put them in charge of something. And I would love to see Christians leaning in more with courage to say, okay, I see something and I have an idea about what could be done about it.
We got about 2 minutes left in the whole show. So, kind of speak into this as a Christian who desires other Christians to really be shaped by church life. So give me that exhortation if I'm on the fence and not sure what's next.
Yeah. The idea for this book was really born about 5 years ago when I was sitting across the campfire from one of my extended family members, and we were talking about the Christian faith, and he said, I still believe in Jesus, and I still read the Bible and all that, but I don't need church. I don't need anybody telling me what to do. And it was in that moment that I realized that our fierce individualism and self-determination has actually worked against us, because we think church is only useful if it meets some perceived need that I have. and I can just I can adopt it as one of the tools in my toolkit to make me a better version of myself. And so I go to the gym, I maybe take classes on the side, I see a therapist, and I show up at church. Whatever your sort of personal self-improvement program is, that church is just one more thing that's a part of that. And what I realized is that we need to completely reframe the way we think about church, because this is not about me and my self-improvement. Although we've talked about how flourishing is something that comes through being relationally connected in healthy ways with others. This really is about God and God's glory, and it's about the health of his larger church. And so this is a really big ask. God is asking us to set aside our agendas and connect to his. And as the book of Hebrews says, do not give up the habit of meeting together. This is something God is asking us to do, and whether we understand it or not, whether we can see the immediate value or not, we need to obey. And as we obey, I think we find so many treasures that the Spirit of God can give us, that God has designed to do when we gather. So whether you find a big church or a small church, whether you find a church that's just like your childhood church, or whether you're starting brand new because you are new to the faith, I would just really encourage you to lean in, take a risk, and see what God might do.
Thanks to my guest, Carmen Imes. Thanks to our team here at Moody Radio for the hard work that they do. Remember, Moody Radio is ministry of Moody Bible Institute, and we're thankful for the time that you take to listen. Thanks to our whole team, Karen Hendren, our producer, Merle St. James, our engineer, associate producer, Lisa Gempe, Cheyenne, normally manning the phones, but today we were phone-free. And if you want to hear this program again, as always, go to edstetzerlive.com. All the links to Carmen's resources are there as well. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to, again, having back this next Saturday and every Saturday, or those who listen by podcast, wherever you download your podcast. Again, Ed Stetzer Live is a production of Moody Radio and ministry of Moody Bible Institute. Thanks for listening.